At Drummond Golf, we understand your passion.
Nice roll.
And that's because every Drummond Golf store is owned and run by a local who loves the game as much as you do.
Yeah, it's come off the face really well.
Someone who knows where you play and what you need.
Oh yeah, looking good.
With Australia's biggest range and expert knowledge.
Great. Now let's try that putter with this grip.
So if you want to improve your game, see a local expert at Drummond Golf.
Hello and welcome to episode 97 of The Thing About Golf, Golf Australia magazine's eternal search for an answer to the question, what is it that draws such an eclectic mix of people to this humble game? I'm not sure if humble is the right word there. Rod Morrie's my name, but it's my colleague John Huggan who takes centre stage today because it is he who has reached deep into his contact book to retrieve the name of a man who won't be well known to most listeners, but is very well known at the top end of the game. Huggy, welcome. Been a while since we spoke. Put the listeners out of their misery. Tell us who you cornered recently for a chat about the game.
Well, it's a man who he used to put the fear of God into me, and along with most other journalists. He was David Begg is his name. He was his former director. How can I put it? Director of the media centre at the Open Championship. He was in charge, and by goodness, he was in charge. He'll laugh when he hears me say these things now, but. Yeah, he ruled with a rod of iron, to put it mildly. There was rules in the media centre, and by goodness, you stuck with them or you were out. So, yes, he's been gone for a while now, but he's most well known actually in Scotland, more as a radio commentator. He commentated on the football, soccer in Scotland for years, and he was terrific at that. Really, very distinctive voice and delivery. But he's in golf. The Open Championship was kind of where he made his name.
So known by all of those who've won the trophy over the last however many years, and all of those who's contended and been there, but not really known by the public. One of those odd positions in golf, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at when he was doing the job, he's in all the pictures at the end. When the presentations, David was the guy who would usher the new champion to the presentation and all that kind of stuff. And he hosted the interviews in the media centre with the big names. And he was also, in a past life, for a brief period, he was the secretary of the Scottish PGA. Before that, yeah. So he's been around.
Diverse range of skills that he's got on display there. Of course, The least fun of all of that, Huggy, would have been looking after the wretched ink scribblers in the media centre at the Open in what was a very different time. You said there were rules and they were followed. It's kind of not like that anymore, is it? There's been huge changes in the media landscape, obviously, in the digital age. But give us a taste of what it was like back then.
It was different. It was everybody was just in print media. There was no social media stuff going on. And you basically, it was a lot easier to follow the rules. I mean, there were, but then again, you have to deal with people like me whose attitude to rules is, I'll just keep going until somebody stops me, kind of thing. So I think there's more and more of that kind of attitude out there.
Indeed. Did he enjoy sitting back and reflecting on his time? Because it's not something I imagine he gets asked about, certainly in depth, all that often.
No, I went to his home in Glasgow, a part of Glasgow called Mulgai, which I'd never been to before. It was a real sort of adventure for me to find his house, but I did eventually. And he was great. I mean, we went to lunch and he welcomed. He's long retired, but he welcomed, I think, the opportunity to reminisce a bit, yeah. Indeed.
And in many ways it's important, Huggy, on a serious note, we do need to remember these times and capture these stories, don't we? Because otherwise they disappear. And that would be a shame for the game. This is part of that rich fabric of the game for those who are really interested in it. The stories he'll have to tell will stay with people.
Well, that's right. And I think it's an important part of, we have a wide variety of people on this podcast, but I think it's important to talk to the older members of the golfing society just to get their stories and get them on record and never forgotten.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We make mistakes in this game. We've been making them for a long time, not capturing things that should be captured. So part of what we're doing here is trying to do some of that. Well, let's hand it over to yourself and David Begg, and the listeners, I'm sure, will enjoy some fabulous stories. I'm not going to get you to tell any of them. I want the listeners to sit and hear some of the stories that David's got to tell. Been great to take some time for us today. Huggy.
My pleasure.
Okay, here we go. I'm joined this time around on the Thing About Golf podcast by a voice that will be very familiar to if we've got any Scottish listeners, but a name that will be familiar worldwide to most golfers, I think, who followed the Open Championship back in the day. David Begg, the former press officer for the Open Championship. What was or is the thing about golf for you?
Well, the thing about golf for me is not just that it's a cruel mistress, as has been said in the past, or not just that it's a science and the study of a lifetime and you never crack the code, as David Forgan put in the creed for the golfer back in the late 19th century. The thing about golf for me is it gets under your skin. And once you've got the bug, you never, ever lose the love for the game. The playing of it was something I did and enjoyed for 60 years. I would never take one single moment of that back. The administration of the game was something that was a privilege and got me very close to some of the great players and great administrators in world golf, and I would not take a single moment of that back either.
Were you any good?
I was
Not
good
the
enough.
At the playing, I should say.
Well, I was, to a degree, I was good enough. I didn't start playing golf until I was 14, and I was down to 4 handicap by the time I was 15. Right. I got an old set of clubs, hickory shafted, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. And indeed, I played in the British Boys once in 1963. Uh-huh. Got through a couple of rounds playing with the odd hickory shafted club still in the bag. I mean, the 1960s, that was unheard of. Yeah. And the old caddies at Prestwick would look at me askance and think, what on earth is this? And the first bunker I was ever in was at the third at Prestwick, the great Cavendish bunker there. And I was playing a lad called Duncan Sinclair. And I said to him, can I move this stone? He says, no. Do you not know the rules? I said, well, actually, I've never been in a bunker before. and I managed to beat him. And he said, really, had you never been in a bunker before? I said, no, Aberfoyle Golf Club, which is the one I played at, didn't have any bunkers. We had fences round the greens, animals grazing.
That would have been a huge boost to me if I'd been your opponent and you'd announced that you'd never been in a bunker before.
On a links course, particularly. And I was in several war bunkers before the game was over. Yeah. And I got through a couple of rounds. And in that game, when I was knocked out in the third round by a guy, Stamper, from the north of England, he made 4 from the car park.
At Prestwick?
At Prestwick, which neither of us knew was out of bounds. And one of the eminent Scottish golf writers, Norman Mayer, came over to me and said, what happened? Because by this time they're taking an interest in this unknown Scot from nowhere who's suddenly in the third round. Yeah. I said, well, he made a 4 and he won the last hole with a 4. Yeah. He said, but the car park's out of bounds. But we'd shaken hands. Yeah. And that was the end of it for me. Yeah. So there was my introduction to golf. Yeah. But I loved it. I mean, my father was a minister. For your international listeners.
Son of the Manse.
Son of the Manse. Yes. A clergyman, a priest, whatever. My grandfather was a minister as well. In fact, he was a minister who used to go to Celtic Park one week and would be welcomed in, come away, Ben, Father, and go to Rangers, Ibrox the following week. And they had a special section for ministers there. But my father was a minister, and I was born in Tain, overlooking a wonderful golf course designed by old Tom Morris. And I think it was in me there. I mean, I used to play in the garden. The garden was huge. So it wasn't the first time I'd held a club when I went onto a golf course. Mm-hmm. When I went as a 14-year-old in 1960, I got a set of clubs from Forgan's. The guy said, have you any balls? I said, no. He said, look, I'll give you half a dozen balls. Mm-hmm. And you're on your own after that. So that was the start of golf. Played the Jubilee, 104 shots round. That was my first ever game of golf, played in a gabardine coat.
That's a picture. And how did you progress then? I mean, I know you, as I said, the people in Scotland will know you more for the football and the commentary, but your golf's been a huge part of your life. Obviously, that's why we're doing this. Well, but how did it? It was. Begin?
I got the offer of a job as a 15-year-old in Canada as an assistant pro, and my father said, "No, you're not going. There's no future in golf," was his approach. Well, if only you could see the wealth that's around nowadays. Yeah. But I took his advice and I didn't go. I went to university, hated it. I graduated in economics and history and got a job as a salesman working for a company called Burroughs, which became Unisys. People may be familiar with that name in the States and elsewhere. And golf kind of took a bit of a back seat. I mean, I was a member at Codder Golf Club we married in 1974, Anne, and we had 2 young children. I stopped playing golf for a number of years, got back into it in 1980. But by then I had been PGA secretary, because in 1977, we were in bed and I was reading the Glasgow Herald and I leapt out of bed shouting, I found it, I found it. And she said, get back into bed.
I think you should explain what you mean by that, David.
Yeah, well, we were husband and wife. Just the last thing before putting off the light and going to sleep, I read the Herald, because I'd been down in London on the Friday, and here was this advert, PGA Secretary, Scottish Region.
Right.
Malcolm Mitchell, who was my predecessor, had moved on to the Belfry to work for Colin Snape. So they were looking for a replacement. Now, at this point, I'm still earning really good money, seriously good money, working for Unisys. And I said, and I found it. This is the job I want to do. And it was half the salary. And, you know, she's thinking, well, my goodness, well, exactly. How can we make ends meet?
Yeah.
Because she already had one child born in 1977, huge mortgage and overdraft. But for 2 years, I ran the PGA Scottish Region, which consisted of basically 7 very good 72-hole tournaments in those days, in which young players cut their teeth, and a huge number of pro-ams, which are currently the thing, and a circuit worth in those days around £100,000. And I brought a bit of administrative talent to that job. Malcolm had been a bit chaotic. Right. Great fun, wonderful guy. Sponsors and players loved him, but absolute chaos in the background. Yeah. I kind of got things sorted out. But then I left that job under a wee bit of a cloud.
I want to talk more about that job before you go any further. I mean, was that the Tartan Tour at the point?
That was the Tartan Tour.
Did it become the Tartan Tour afterwards?
That was the Tartan Tour. It was embryonic, I would say. It was taken on to even greater things in terms of the numbers of pro-ams.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in terms of the numbers of tournaments, because I think with the Northern Open and a number of other good sponsors, we had really good 72-hole tournaments that actually taught people how to play. And at that time, we were supported by the top pros.
Yeah. Well, the question I was going to ask was, I mean, the pro-ams kind of took over maybe later on after your time. But, and it became less of a training ground for guys who wanted to play tournament golf.
It did.
Because it's a different philosophy, 18-hole sprint, obviously, from a 72-hole. So my question was it, at your time, was it still a breeding ground for guys who were ambitions to go on?
It was. I think it was. I think there was enough there for them to feel they were learning about winning over 72 holes. Yeah. And, you know, the Assistants Championship was 72 holes. The Northern Open was 72 holes. And you got people of great calibre playing in it, like Brian Barnes, like Sam Torrance, like Bernard Gallagher.
Right.
And playing alongside these guys, that allowed the younger players to see what the standard was and how much they had to improve.
Yeah. So how long were you there?
And
I know why you left. So
you know why I left.
Well,
I started the job in the January of 1978. And my first day was a flight to Spain for the El Paraiso 3D Pro-Am. A guy, Frank Durbin and David Hirsch, were two of the Ds, and Diaries was the other one.
Right.
And I flew out and I thought, this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I'm looking after this. It was effectively a Pro-Am, but it was a 54-hole tournament out at El Paraiso. And that was a great start to the thing and gradually built into it. We then progressed and got more tournaments the next year. We were struggling to get a sponsor, unfortunately, in 1979 for the Scottish Championship, which up until then had been sponsored by Rank Xerox as part of a national agreement through the various regional PGAs. Colin Snape had got them on board, but they didn't want to do the Scottish anymore. And Scottish Television came along and said, we'll do the Scottish, only for their cameramen to go on strike and not be able to cover a fantastic event won by Sandy Lyle in a playoff with Sam Torrance. Right. Didn't get any better than that. But shortly thereafter,
Was that when it was at Dalmahoy?
no, it was at Glasgow Gales that year.
Right.
And
It went to Dalmahoy after that, I think.
it went to Dalmahoy after
Yeah,
that when
yeah.
the Brewers came on
Right,
board.
yeah,
and
yeah.
Big Barnsley was famously
Yeah.
seen marking his ball.
Slightly inebriated,
And-
yes.
but he could play. I mean,
Aye, I know.
in Northern that year, up at Elgin, he played in a sou'wester, and some of the best shots I've ever seen.
Yeah, I actually witnessed him marking the ball with the can of lager.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he was giving the sponsors a bit of a plug.
Yeah.
And that's how he saw it. He was fun. He was a troubled man in other ways,
He
as
was,
we know.
yeah.
When I was troubled at times in my life, he was very supportive, I have to say that.
Yeah.
So anyway, we get through the Scottish, everything's fine, but we have an event in Edinburgh at Morton Hall, and the lads turned up there for the prize giving, dressed poorly, shall I say.
Right.
The club were not happy.
What was the rule at the time?
The rule
How
at
should
that
they have been?
point, well, they should just have been smart casual,
Right.
just golfing gear.
Yeah.
But there were jeans, there was unshaven.
Right.
One or two had 2 or 3 too many, and a very eminent sponsor was on board for the first time, and I thought, this is really going to be good.
Yeah.
So I went back to the committee and said, look, the standards are not what they should be. Right, what do we do about it? And they said, well, what we'll do about it is it'll be jacket, collar and tie for the prize giving from now on. I said, oh, that won't work. No.
It's too big a jump.
It's too big a jump. The guys won't do that.
Yeah.
Of course, what happens is we have another big tournament at Drumpellier Golf Club, and Bernard Gallagher is there and is in the top 3 who have to turn up for the prize giving. And I said, look, Bernard, who would be the best dressed golfer in the world at that time, beautiful cashmeres, everything hunky-dory, terrific. I said, it's jacket, collar and tie. I'm not putting on a collar and tie. I said, well, it's a £10 fine, unfortunately.
£10.
I mean, it was derisory and it was wrong.
Yeah.
And maybe I didn't handle it properly, but that was the rule. And the committee had said, you have to apply that without fear or favour. Well, I did. Bernard wasn't happy. The boys who were writing about the game at that time met him down south. I'm never coming back to Scotland as long as David Begg is the PGA Scottish Region Secretary.
Yeah.
So Bill Watson, who was a venerable pro and a great pal of Lord Derby, who was the patron of the PGA, met with Bernard and rescinded the fine.
So he never paid his tenner.
He never paid his tenner.
No.
The fine was rescinded, but I got to read about the fine being rescinded in the Glasgow Herald the next morning. Right. And I said to the guys, well, you can take your job and stick it where the sunshine is. I'm out of here. Yeah. You can't leave. I said, I've just done it. Yeah. I'm gone. You had to support me. You made the rule.
Mind you there.
Yeah, you made the rule. Yeah. I applied. I told you it wasn't a good rule.
Yeah.
And you've thrown me under the bus. There's no way now I've got any standing within the game.
Yeah.
Within the top upper echelons.
Yeah. Well, they've stopped listening to you at this point.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I did resign. By that point, Anna's pregnant with her second child. We've got only a car that's done 120,000 miles and is 15 years old. Right. We've got a £10,000 overdraft. We've got a high mortgage. We're in Stoke. What do I do? Yeah. Well, there were 2 very good guys in the background there had followed my career, and they encouraged me to write about golf as a freelance. So that is what I duly did. Yeah. And in 6 months earned £250. So that wasn't going to work, was it? So I then had to decide, right, do I stay in this or do I go back to the computer industry where I was going to be very welcome at a decent salary of $15,000 a year, as opposed to the $6,000 from the PGA. Phone rang on. Colin Snape, actually at the Belfry, said, look, come down and work for me here. If you want to, split your losses in terms of the PGA, come and work for me. And I said, no, I'm going to do my own thing. I've been let down. I can't go down that path. I'm not going to go back to be a computer salesman, which I enjoyed, by the way, although my mother always said to me, when are you getting a real job? Yeah. She couldn't fathom that a salesman of any sort was a real job.
Right, yeah.
So I decided I would
have thought that would be more of a real job than working for the PGA. In some ways.
It was and it wasn't. I mean, some of my best friends are still from that day. Yeah. I've kept in touch with these guys. Gradually the numbers are dwindling. Yeah. But we were thick as thieves. When you got an order, you went out to celebrate. Just as a player winning a tournament would go and celebrate. So we got a big order for $3 million. Right. Well, we celebrated that because the commission was 3% on $3 million. So that was healthy money. It was good stuff. So I didn't go back. I decided to become a freelance golf writer, but I needed to do something else. And the something else was run top amateur golf tournaments. Mm-hmm. And I had a couple of good contacts. One was with Famous Grouse, and we ran a thing called the Famous Grouse Shotgun Foursomes. Mm-hmm. I gradually set up an office on the south side of Glasgow, recruited a team. It changed over the years. 2 of the journalists would cover everything that moved in amateur golf, women's golf, minor professional golf, tartan tour, home internationals. We were there. We covered it. And we took over from a very well-known guy that some of the older listeners might remember, very few, a guy, Tom Marshall, Doc Tom. And Doc Tom covered all this. And we got huge amounts of space because Eddie Roger in the Herald, who was the sports editor of the Herald, and Ian Wood in the Scotsman said, David, we will give you a platform. Mm-hmm. So that was stable. We knew we were going to get some income from that.
And how useful was your PGA experience in all of this? I mean, I don't want to move on too quickly from the PGA. What was the PGA like back then? I mean, is it different from what you assume it is now? I mean, I'm sure the numbers will be bigger for a start.
I don't know. We were there arguing the corner for PGA professionals. Part of your remit in those days was to try and get them better conditions of employment. Yeah. Security of employment, better salaries, because very often clubs, they really didn't want a pro. No. I mean, there would be under 160 club pros in Scotland at that point, and it gradually grew. More clubs provided better facilities, better shops. The tournament side, I don't think is as good now.
Well, you could argue, of course, that you were training them to be golf professionals rather than professional golfers, which is a different thing. Yes.
Yeah. They were basically teaching pros,
which is not to diminish that. I mean,
it's terrific. And if I'd gone,
that's really what the PGA is for, in my mind. More than teaching out people how to play.
Yeah,
that's what the tour's for.
I mean, had I gone to Canada, I would never have made it as a tournament pro. I didn't have the right temperament, because I would have let myself down eventually. Blowing a gasket, I beg you rant, people would say. But I think I would have made a very decent club pro, a good teacher. They also did club repairs in those days. Yeah. So part of my time was spent getting better conditions and contracts for the club pros. The other part trying to get this tartan tour up and running, look for sponsors, negotiate, try and get television rights as well, because if you get television, you could get sponsorship. And all of that taught me quite a lot.
I was going to say, all good training for you.
Very good. Yeah. I mean, I had been the branch manager for boroughs in Edinburgh, looking after branches in Dundee and Aberdeen as well as Edinburgh, with 30 salesmen and engineers reporting to me. So I had experience of running a business. Yeah. But the admin of a freelance activity, because every pound you got was a prisoner, you really did work very hard at it. I didn't give myself a decent salary until 1991. The first 11 years, Anne was getting clothes from jumble sales for Lorna. Really? Boys' clothes were never quite available because they would tend to wear them out. Yeah. We didn't have a lot of money. My partner in those days, Stuart McDougall, who succeeded me as the RNA's press officer, was getting the same money or more at that point. But we did okay. We survived. And that was the great thing. We did survive and we came out the other side. And one of the things I'm most proud of are the number of people that have gone through the business. Yeah. We called it David Begg Sports, for the want of a better term, because I had a wee bit of a profile. And in amongst that, I got a bit more of a profile because I started to do commentary on football. Yeah. Soccer.
On the radio.
On the radio. Yeah. I had a great face for radio. Yeah. I did have the opportunity now and again to do television, but it never quite happened. Right. Both in terms of at the beginning of my broadcasting career and at the end, there had been a couple of chances to get on the box, which is where you get better known and get more money. Yeah. But anyway, the business was pretty solid.
It sounds like it was a kind of passion that was keeping you going here. I mean,
that's the love of golf. Yeah. As I said, it gets under your skin. Yeah. I wasn't giving up on this dream. Yeah. And here was another shape to the dream. It wasn't, here's this for the Open. It was, well, this is how we're going to set it up for somebody else to go and win the Open. Yeah. So
who are I know Scott Crockett, who's now the head of the media department at the European, the DP World Tour. I keep calling it the European Tour. He's one of your, And
Martin Dempster, who's chairman of the Association of Golf Writers.
Golf writer at the Scotsman. Yeah.
Elspeth Burnside, who was well known in our coverage of women's golf.
Yeah.
A young guy, Gary Kewen, who's won the Sports Writer of the Year award, but operates in the field of soccer. Alex Spink, who
He's at Daily Mirror, I think. Yeah.
was the Daily Mail at one time. I don't quite know, but he's a chief rugby writer.
Yeah.
So some good people came through the training ground of that. There was a guy, Glenn Stirling, was another agency in the west of Scotland covering everything else, but not golf.
Right.
So we didn't cross one another.
Right.
And that was the thing. You didn't cross into somebody else's territory. Sandy Sutherland would be a name that some people would know, who was in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And so we didn't get much involved in events in the east of Scotland.
Right.
But
That's the civilised part of the country for those listening, by the way.
yes, it is. But so you know, it's like window cleaners in Mulgai and Bearsden. You might think the window cleaners would operate anywhere, but they have their own streets.
Yeah.
And nobody else dare touch that street.
Yeah.
Or they'll be sorted out. Now, we didn't quite sort people out. But eventually, as part of that, I was writing about golf, and a lad, Alistair Nicklaus, whom some people will remember,
Daily
was
Record, yeah.
an outstanding golf writer for the Daily Record. Rupert, he was called, in his nickname. He came to me one day and said, would you be interested in doing the press officer's job at one of the major tournaments? Because I know a tournament that's looking for someone, and I would like to put your name forward.
Give me the job description for a press officer at a tournament.
Well, the job description is that basically the press officer organises the facilities for the golf writers and the golf photographers so that they can operate as if they had their office at the venue for a week.
So your job's to make my job easier. Is that fair?
And to liaise with the top players to make their job easier, because there are heavy demands, or were in those days heavy demands, on the leading players to come and be interviewed, to be photographed, to do pre-tournament publicity, or whatever. So there would be 7 days involved in the planning of all of that. But it was pretty low key in those days.
Did you have to deal with the agents or the players? Because nowadays you'd be speaking to agents.
Both. But more and more it became agents.
Yeah.
But I always tried, and it evolved. The job evolved. It was called the press centre because it was for the press. The written press had a stranglehold on the coverage and dictating the terms.
What year are we talking about?
We're talking 1980.
Right.
And the tournament was the Benson and Hedges that Alistair put me forward for.
Was that at Fulford?
And it was at Fulford, and they had a very good sponsorship manager in a guy, Len Owen, with his number 2 being another well-known name in the world of golf, Derek Pillage. Pillage ran the British Caledonian Lions, which had Barnes and David Ingram and Tommy Horton and all sorts of other, McAllister. And so Len Owen set a very high bar in terms of standards.
Well, there was a lot of big-name Americans played in that event, wasn't there?
Billy Casper, we come across.
Trevino played.
Trevino played. Mr. Lou. They would always have one marquee name from outside of the European Tour playing there. But they also had very good European Tour fields. I mean,
look at the
really
list of winners.
top-class players at that time. I mean, Fulford wasn't necessarily the greatest golf course.
No.
But it was a very welcoming club.
Yeah.
It was very distinctive. It became very famous when Langer climbed into the tree.
I was just going to say that.
It was
see
great.
the pictures. Yeah.
But Len Owen, he said, look, we need to do this properly. Whereas other events, which I'll come to, weren't nearly as well organised and weren't as much aware of the need to make it good. Fine dining became a good thing for Len Owen. So the guys would go to another marquee and have a really good lunch.
Yeah. I mean, the European Tour then, you could describe it as basic compared with what it is now in terms of the way the players are treated. I mean, I hear stories from guys that played, back in the day, and there was no, players area. They were hitting their own practice balls. They were aiming at their caddies, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it was embryonic because it only started in the early 1970s.
That's
with, well, I think George Sims as one of the leading admin or people in the background of that.
Yeah.
But so it was at its beginning as well. Ken Scrover was now on board, and he also needed to drive the thing forward. But of course, it's difficult, and it's gradually expanding. A lot of events played in the UK in those days, much more than nowadays. So I got into become the press officer. It was a good start and a good training. They were very definite, and a lot of the golf writers at that time said, now this is how you've got to run this place. You run it with a rod of iron.
Mm-hmm. And you did, David.
Well, apparently I did. And I
remember. I was there.
I wish I had my time. I wish I had time again. And I would have perhaps been a little more sympathetic to the odd request.
Yes.
But anyway, I used to say no.
Well put.
I used to say no.
Yeah.
Because I was told, don't let chancers in. Don't let guys in who are not full-time accredited golf writers or sports writers, at the very least. Yeah. You know, too many people coming in here and abusing the privileges of getting access to the press centre. Because the press centre was the place to be. Yeah. Because you got close to the players. You heard them speak about the game. You dealt with them in their moment of victory and defeat. Yeah. And it was great fun, actually. I mean, I loved it. But my God, it was brutal. You'd be getting up at 5 in the morning. Yeah. You were there again at 10 at night. Yeah. You know, you couldn't sleep. Mm-hmm. So for a week, I was out on my feet. And it got worse when I got onto the Open. Yeah. Because that followed on from doing the Bench and Hedges. I did okay, the first Bench and Hedges, and I got a phone call from George Sims, who by this time had moved into media work. He had got involved with John Jacobs in setting up the European Tour in the early 70s. He was the former sports editor of the Daily Telegraph. He was a very well-respected figure in Fleet Street, and he had become the R&A's press officer doing the Open. But it was Heath Robinson stuff. I mean, it was hideous. The facilities were awful. Right. They had a box. They had a little guy called Pegleg.
I remember him, yeah.
Pegleg was an amazing little man.
Yeah, he used to drive in a little mini moke.
He did a mini moke. Yeah. And he would unearth the green bays to cover these trestle tables. Now, the trestle tables had been at the Chelsea Flower Show. And it's not like the Chelsea Flower Show nowadays. Yeah. And they still had all the staples in them from the Chelsea Flower Show. Yeah, yeah. And they would be covered in green baize to try and make it look good. And this green baize would have tea and coffee spilt in it, food spilt in it. And it was just wrapped up.
And how big were these tables?
These tables were about 6 foot wide and about 3 foot deep.
For one for each person?
No, 2 people at a table. Yeah. So your elbows in. And shared facilities in terms of telephones at the back in many cases. No mobile phones in those days. And it became a major thing to get your own phone. I mean, you were really somebody if you had your own phone on your table. Yeah. And 1 or 2 of the Fleet Street guys aspired to that. But these facilities were awful.
You know the feeling when your mate's golf ball flies past yours? Or when you're on the green in regulation, but he holes it from the bunker? At Drummond Golf, we get it. That's why we have our lowest price guarantee. As Australia's biggest, you can count on our massive buying power for the lowest prices in golf. But if you do happen to find a lower advertised price, we'll beat it. The Drummond Golf lowest price guarantee. Unbeatable. Conditions apply.
What was the scoring system like then?
Well,
or was there a scoring system?
There was, and you know, the scoring system was way ahead of its time. There was a family called the Sandersons, Alec and June, and the offspring then followed them on board, and they were terrific. And it was hole-by-hole scoring. At some tournaments overseas, it would be 3-hole scoring because they couldn't get enough decent people to operate the radios. Yeah. But there would be the odd mistake. It wasn't like now, you know, where you get plotted every shot. So you see,
any of them stand out?
No, they don't, because I wasn't involved in that. Right. That was given over to the professionals. And June and Alec would sit at the front on a table to the right-hand side of the front row, looking up at the board, and the kids that they employed, including their own family, would put the scores in. So the press could then look and see what players, and it was colour-coded, red for a birdie, black for a par, blue for a bogey. It was very clear. It was very well done. They were ahead of their time.
And that lasted a long time.
Oh, a long time. We saw me out. Mm-hmm. They were still going strong when I retired in 1997 from that world, although I did a couple of women's events after that, because IMG were very good to me and they kept me going. So the scoring there was good. But then I was going back to say that George Sims heard that I'd done okay at the Bench and Hedges. So he phoned me up and said, would you like to come down to the Open at Royal St George's and have a look around?
This is 81,
81.
Is it? Bill Rogers.
Bill Rogers.
Yeah.
And he said, come down, have a look and see if you would like to be considered for the job. Mm-hmm. So I said, yeah, that sounds great, because who's going to say no to that?
Exactly, yeah.
Anyway, so I go down, and I'm really just a bit of a spare and just help out the girls on the scoreboard,
yeah.
but get a feel for the place. And then at the end of it, in September of 81, George and Keith Mackenzie asked me to come through to St Andrews to a meeting and said, look, we would like you to succeed George. George wants to
Keith
take
Mackenzie
a back
was
seat. Keith Mackenzie was the R&A secretary.
And no one ever, I mean, there's been good secretaries since then, but no one's ever said, champion golfer of the year, quite like he did.
He was a wonderful guy.
Yeah.
He really was a wonderful guy. He was gruff with a heart of gold. Mm-hmm. You never, ever, ever asked him for anything in the afternoon. There was a brown cabinet in his office. And he would say, now, we'll have a little something before lunch. Yeah. So anything you wanted, you asked Keith before lunch, because the brown cabinet wasn't just for glasses of water.
Yeah. What was his tipple?
His tipple was gin and tonic.
Right, yeah.
And it was fine. He was a lovely man, and his heart was in the right place, and he saved the Open. There was no question about that.
Yeah.
He got on board and brought the Open up to a status that the top Americans would come.
He went to America and talked him into coming.
He did.
Yeah.
He talked him into coming. He upped the prize money, and the R&A said to him, we'll go bust if you have this prize money. And Keith said to him, you'll go bust if we don't.
Aye.
And he got it right. And as well as Palmer and Nicklaus at player, and the big three and others coming through saving the Open, Keith Mackenzie was the man, to me, who saved the Open and maintained its status as one of the majors. And of course it is now and will be forever, I think, because of history on its side. So anyway, I'd say to them, yeah, I'd love this job. And George Sims said to me, do you really want this job? I said, what do you mean? You lose all your friends. I said, oh, George, surely not. He said, there'll be nobody at my funeral.
Well, I wouldn't quite go that far, but I tell you what, David, you were pretty scary.
Well,
I was pretty young back then. I hesitated to ask for anything.
His rationale was, he said, you'll lose all your friends, and here's why you lose all your friends. The ones you've got at the moment, you'll be so busy in the run-up to the Open and the other events, which you're now going to get, because you'll get other events as a result of doing the Open. Your profile is right up there. And it did take me to Monte Carlo, to Malaysia, to Australia, to America, and all over. He said, you'll lose all your friends because you'll have to say no to them. This is the new ones.
I remember.
And you won't have time to explain why you're saying no.
Yeah.
Because if you think of the Open in those days, eventually got to 1,200 people we accredited between photographers and written press and television people. Mm-hmm. And they'll come looking for a favour.
Did you oversee who got and who didn't?
Everything.
Yeah.
All the applications came in. We did it by snail mail in those days.
Yeah.
There was no internet. Yeah. So it all came in. A form was sent out, had to be returned by the end of March. Mm-hmm. And accreditation was given, and the credentials were sent out, little gate entry cards, to come and see the Open, and they got their badge when they got there. I mean, security was nil.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you could not get away with that.
No.
It was hideous. But that was the way it was.
Yeah.
The tent, for example, had been at the Royal Show. And in 1986, as recently as that, it wasn't even up the week before the Open.
At Turnberry that year.
At Turnberry.
Yeah.
And it arrived late.
Yeah.
And it was dumped down on the sand that had been levelled off. And when they hoisted up the tent on the poles, the sand then showered down. And for the rest of that week at Turnberry in 86, people were having sand sprinkled on their hair. Anyway.
That was back when I had hair, I hasten to add.
Your George had said you'll lose all your friends because you won't be able to take the time to explain why it's no. Because he said if 1,200 people, if you give them all 5 minutes, you don't have 100 hours in a week.
Yeah.
So you just have to say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that.
Yeah.
And then move on. It was a wall of humanity coming to me because I tended to be too much hands-on.
Yeah.
More and more after that, and after I was gone, others would delegate. And I was terrible at delegating. That was my biggest weakness. I could not delegate. I wanted to know exactly why that guy was in or why that guy wasn't in, and who was this and who was that.
Yeah.
And it was too much hands-on. And I was a perfectionist as well. I wanted it to go well. And I didn't really know when it hadn't gone well. I mean, Michael Benalla, I didn't know this until quite recently, didn't like me very much. which was amazing because I loved him. He was a lovely, lovely guy.
Yeah.
He used to sit in his little porta cabin doing the Daily Telegraph crossword in particular. I mean, so laid back.
Yeah.
Michael just wanted everybody to have a good time. Yeah. But because I was so definite, and sometimes it involves saying no, he would then intervene behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. But I'd learned my lesson from the PGA and from my resignation there. We had one, for example, with Jack Newton at Lytham. He was working for a TV company, I think it was Channel 9. They didn't have the rights to television. So IMG said, they can't come in. So I had to say to Jack, look, Jack, I'm really sorry. You can't come in here. I would, if it was down to me, I would love to have you in.
I knew Jack Newton. How did he react to that?
Well, he wasn't happy.
No, I can imagine.
No, he wasn't happy because he's been forced. But I don't write the contract. IMG had the international rights, and they wrote the contracts, and Jack Newton's channel wasn't allowed in. So he had to report from the pavement outside. But of course, naturally, he goes to Michael and said, look, I'm being denied access to the media centre. And Michael said, come in. Well, I didn't react. I said, fine, it's your decision. Because you have to then give the hierarchy its responsibility. And he was, in the end of the day, the decision maker. And this time I accepted it.
Yeah, that was not a battle you were ever going to win. So,
never. So there was no point in arguing.
Exactly.
And I was pleased in the end. But of course, as far as Jack was concerned, I was the bad lad.
Aye, yeah.
And he didn't really forgive me.
Yeah.
But actually, it was IMG that were the bad lads in that case. Yeah. Because they had the rights, they were exercising their right, and other broadcasters stayed away. But Jack was determined he was coming to that Open.
How did you deal with the top players? Give me we need some anecdotes here of your favourites and the ones that you were less of your favourites, shall we say?
I have to say, I got on really well with all the top players. I made it my job to be the one person on the ground that would go and welcome them to the Open. Whether the R&A were involved in something else, whether Michael was involved in something else as he took over from Keith McKenzie in the mid-80s, I made sure that when they checked in, I gave the women who were doing the checking in of players, giving them their badges for their families and so on, I made sure that they would give me a phone call and I would go over and see the player when they first checked in at the course. Say, welcome to the Open. Obviously, we would like to see you. What day would suit? And began to make a schedule of interviews. Right. Now, that's done differently now. Yeah. Because now you go to the agent and say, we would like Tiger on Tuesday. Yeah. We would like whoever on Wednesday. Yeah.
So where did you draw your line on guys that you would go and greet? And guys that you just didn't bother about.
Well, there were the holders of the major events.
There's got to be a line somewhere.
Well, no, there were the big names. I mean, everybody had big names.
Yeah.
Nicklaus used to say that winning majors was easier than winning ordinary tournaments, much to Colin Montgomery's consternation.
Yeah.
But there were the big names, and you would see Jack before any Open at that stage, certainly early on.
Yeah, well, but
regardless,
he's a given. But
he's a given.
There's lower down. There's got to be a point.
You would then see whoever had won the Masters,
right.
Whoever had won the US Open. The PGA was played after the Open in those days. So the current holders of major titles were givens. The leading players in the European Order of Merit and the PGA Tour Order of Merit were given. Course specialists, somebody who had won the Open at that venue in the past. How does it feel to be back? Talk us through that. And these are for interviews in advance of the championship starting. Always starting on a Thursday in my time. It moved to a Sunday finish in 1980. Up until then, of course, it had been, well, going back to the 60s, people qualified. Even the holder qualified. Yeah. I mean, people can't believe that it would finish on a Friday.
Yeah.
Those
well, they're all back, so they could get back to the shop on Saturday morning.
Well, so exactly that. When John Panton and Eric Brown, if you take the Scots. So I was very fortunate with the players. I got on well with virtually every one of them. There were one or two that could be prickly and make life a wee bit difficult. There would be one or two that would say, no, I'm not coming in. And believe it or not, one who'd always say no to me before a championship was the late, great Payne Stewart, with whom I got on really well.
Yeah.
And it was lovely. When he won the US Open, he came to Monte Carlo as the specialist attraction for that event. And we had a wonderful meal with him and his wife overlooking the bay up in Ez. It was a cash-only transaction. Renton Laidlaw was our host, Roger Shackleton, who used to play rugby for England, was the event organiser, and there was Payne. But Payne would always say to me, look, David, I just like to keep it pretty quiet, low-key. You'll see me on Thursday if I have a good score. So once we get into the tournament, it was anybody who had a good score. Yeah, they would come in, and you would be started down for far too long in many cases. I mean, the big eye-opener for me was 1982 and Bobby Clampett. And he was running away with it after 36 holes. He was involved inside the media centre, or the press centre as it was then, for 2 hours. He lost the Open there and then. Whereas other players knew how to manage their time. Some players never, in my time, managed to handle the press. They had to do it on their terms. Faldo adjusted, and as a result, became very good. And for example, when he did win in 1982, he said to me, in 1992, he said to me, thank you for keeping it tight this week. It's made the difference. Because you could lose too much energy looking after the newspapers and the television companies and the radio stations. If you did them all, you were spending valuable energy. I mean, I've got something written down because I did a speech when I retired from this in 1997. And if you go over the Open champions, Tom Watson was easily the most disciplined of all those with whom I had any dealings. Having won in 1982, we had to have him traditionally as the last interview on the Wednesday prior to the play starting in 1983. And he wasn't happy with his putting. And I said, I'll meet you over at the putting green. And he said, yeah. And I sat for an hour and a half. Now, because it was my first Open on my own, George Sims had been with me in 1982, I was desperate not to lose Tom Watson, because imagine if he wandered away and we didn't get the defending champion in the press tent. There would have been uproar from the writers. So I sat on that fence. He putted. He said, right, now I'm ready. And he came with me, and he wrote history. He retained the Open. Seve Ballesteros was easily the most charismatic. I mean, it was like a light bulb coming on. I sat beside him and I looked at him and thought you could tell his mood just from the sheen on his face. When he was angry, there was a darkness came over him. And when he was exploding in joy, there was this brilliant radiance came out. Jumbo Ozaki, funny enough, never a winner of an Open and not really in contention. He had that same look about him. Nancy Lopez, she had a sheen. And I thought, no, you are a superstar. And it just was something there. There was something electric about them. Whether it was coming from inside me to think I'm sitting alongside these icons of the game, I don't know. But Seve had it. Yeah. When he won in 84, I was standing beside his mother and he just leapt into her arms at the top of the steps. And first time he had seen her that week, she had just arrived. And it was just wonderful. It was simply wonderful. Yeah. So
I was just jealous of Seve's success with the women back then. I mean, how did you feel about that?
I was okay. he had a lovely wife in Carmen, great kids. It didn't all end well. It was a difficult marriage because of, I think, a different class almost coming together.
Because of him.
Well,
David,
he was a bit of a lad.
Yes.
He was a bit of a lad. But I think
he was a rogue.
What goes on tour stays on
yes,
tour
indeed.
in that one. The contrast to Seve was Sandy Lyle. He finished early, if you remember, and got up and down eventually from Duncan's Hollow. Had to wait to see if David Graham or Langer would.
This is at St George's.
At St George's in 1985. Yeah. And Sandy was the most modest of Open winners. Yeah. Absolutely, an absolute gem of a man. He sat in Michael Benalik's office to watch the closing stages. He'd a phone call with his mum and dad who weren't there, and all that happened was when he won, he just did a quiet little punch of the air, and a smile came over his face. Yeah. And he got the Moroccan belt. It was 125th anniversary of the Open, if you remember that. Nick Faldo was the most emotional.
Really?
Which is quite extraordinary, because I think it meant so much to him when he won in 87, holding off Azinger.
How did you handle your position with him? I mean, you were almost like the buffer between him and the press. I mean, there was faults on both sides, I'm sure, but it was pretty adversarial with him a lot of the time, with especially with the tabloid newspaper guys. Everybody says, well, the press, but it wasn't the press, it was the tabloids. I mean, because I was his ghostwriter for years, writing all his instruction stuff, and you know, he wasn't the most warm individual, but he was very professional and never really a problem. But the tabloids really went after him. I mean, how did you position
and the tabloids,
dealing with that with him specifically?
I wasn't tarnished with their brush.
No.
Because I was independent. I was a line between the press.
That's what I mean. You
and
would
the
be
players.
buffer.
I was a kind of buffer for both.
Yeah.
I mean, I would sometimes have to say to the press guys, look, I'm sorry you can't get him.
Yeah.
He's not coming. And they would be, they'd be mumping and moaning. But that was the way it was. You know, Nick had changed his swing in order to succeed. He and David Ledbetter went back to basics. He was already a fine player, but it wasn't going to hold up, as we discovered when Trevino was playing with him in an Open where he was buying a contention. But because he won in 87 and he ground out those 18 pars, I mean, he just collapsed. And I've got him in one corner in tears, having won. And I've got Asinger in the other corner in tears because he'd lost.
Yeah.
So that's why I say he was the most emotional. I found him very good, actually. I got a lot of time for Nick. A lot of people, he's got a horrible sense of humour that nobody else understands.
18 handicap.
And 18 handicap. He should never make speeches off the cuff. You know, heart of my bottom stuff.
Yeah.
Nonsense.
Yeah.
Don't do that. And he thought he was being smart aleck. But I think he would know now that he wasn't.
I don't think
very
he would
good.
do it again.
He
no.
wouldn't do it again.
No.
You know, he matured into a fine broadcaster. His analysis of play in real time was probably second to none latterly. I don't know. But I mean, I don't know what the international view would be.
I was always a Johnny Miller man. That stuff. Yeah.
Johnny called it as it was, and he would fill out a player for a bad shot.
Yeah.
You know, he would really dissect them. But see, a lot of the golf writers in those days for the tabloids were under instruction from the desk.
Well, the last thing they wanted to write about was the golf.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted scandal. I mean, I was the butt of it.
Yeah.
1988. I was the bear baiter, if you remember that.
I wasn't at that one.
Oh, well, there you are. In 1988, Jack Nicklaus was unwell before the first round. And he actually was in pretty decent form going into that. And he finished, I think, in the top 30 or so. And so he'd been throwing up an hour and a half before his tee-off time. And it was one of these unusual situations where he actually was out early. But I didn't know he'd been unwell. Nobody had told me. But the press guys, somehow or other, they knew he had been unwell. And Seve was shooting 67. So show of hands for Seve, Seve. So I used to ask for a show of hands.
Yeah.
Who wants him in? And if about 20 hands went up, you brought the player in.
Yeah.
If only 2 hands went up, well, you can go and get your own coach.
Aye.
And we would send a guy, Alan Booth, who had shorthand but didn't always come back with the accurate quote.
No.
But anyway, it worked.
Yeah, I remember him.
It worked to a degree.
Yeah.
I mean, it was long before every single word was recorded and put down by the stenographers. So the press guys, you know, said that I had insulted Jack Nicklaus because they had gone to see him after his round. He wasn't coming into the tent. They had gone to see him in a porter cabin and hoisted him onto a table and onto a chair on the table. And he was the bear baiter. I was the bear baiter. And it was all over the tabloids. And I was given a really, really hard time. And the net result of that was it cost me millions.
How so?
Famous golf writers continued with the story right through to the Sundays. The Sunday newspaper guys had a more reflective piece on the week that they had had so far. And Peter Dobereiner gave me an absolute savaging in the Sundays and attributed quotes that I simply hadn't said. And it was about some people hanging his every word, but I'm not one of them. And what I'd actually said to my secretary, which was overheard, was, isn't it amazing how we all hang in his every word? So much was lost in the translation. The story stuck. The European tour then didn't like the idea of me having to threaten legal action against Dobereiner and his paper, The Observer. And they didn't like the idea of me taking an eminent golf writer to court. My lawyer said, look, you will win this, but you will never be able to operate in this field again. Was that a price you were prepared to pay? And I said, no, it's not a price. I want to carry on working in this field. However, Mark Wilson, who was then helping and advising, as a former writer for the Daily Express, was advising the tour by this time, decided that he wanted to get shot of me from European tour events. And although I was contracted to do the Ryder Cup in 1989, they told me not to come to the PGA Championship at Wentworth in the spring of that year, when Volvo were the sponsors. George O'Grady, who was Ken Scoville's number 2 in those days, phoned up and said, look, David, we're going to fall out about this, but I've been told you've not to come. So I then lost.
Yeah. See, I mean, I didn't know anything about this. This is all news. I mean, I was living in America at that time, so it probably passed me by a bit, I would think.
Yeah, and it would pass everybody by because it didn't. I mean, it was who was I? I was nobody. I mean, I was basically just a lackey behind the scenes helping out. And that's all you are as a press officer. You're really not. You're not part of the story.
Well, no. I mean, your profile should not be high in that job.
No, it shouldn't.
No, public profile.
But again, because I had not read the situation properly, because I didn't know. Now, maybe I should have known, but it would have been so handy if some of the guys had tipped me the wink. By the way, Jack's been unwell. I think you should have him in. But at that point, nobody was strong enough or willing enough to do that. Yeah. I think some of them had the story and didn't want to share it with the others. But you see, often at an Open, you would have the golf writer and you would have another. Yeah. And it was the others who were the ones that went for me. Yeah. And they were sitting together and there were 4 of them. And one of them came over to me and said, David, don't read the papers tomorrow. You're going to be absolutely filleted. I said, what have I done? And so then, they mind you, how can they twist the quote? Yeah. And they agreed the story between themselves. I wouldn't name names, but they know who they are.
Well, I'm going to ask you to name names now. I mean, you've named a few of your favourites. Who were the ones that were difficult, shall we say? Are you prepared to let the world know about who they were?
I always found Ronan Rafferty quite difficult. And yet he's a lovely man. Yeah. I mean, with a great penchant for red wine and everything else. And even when they were playing as Ireland, David Fairty was asked, who do you want to play against tomorrow? He said Rafferty, and they were in the same team. Ronan he didn't want to come in. He was really well placed at Turnberry, I think, if I remember. And he said, no, I don't want to come into the tent. He didn't like coming into the press centre. It was a big strain for some guys. Some guys found it difficult. Phil Mickelson, funny enough, was very wary about coming in. I think eventually he did learn to handle it. And when he won at Muirfield, the monkey was off his back. But I always wondered if he was held back from winning because he didn't quite know how to handle the press at that stage in his career. Probably different nowadays. I mean, he's blossomed and gone on.
Well, but yeah, you could say that's one way of putting it.
Well, but so in the early days he was hesitant. Yeah, he was nervous. There were a couple of guys when you shook hands with them to wish them well, you got a wet fish in return, and you thought, you are not going to win this afternoon. Because you always went on to the first tee. That was a kind of tradition that had been handed down. Latterly, I binned it. But you would go into the first tee for the teeing off of the last game. The R&A secretary would go there, and they always wanted me to go there just in case there was anything to happen. And players were irritated by the attention of the photographers in particular at that point. Darren Clark I found quite difficult. Now, I know he was a lovely winner when it all panned out, but in the early days, he found it really difficult. Again, he didn't want to come in. Woozy, to some extent, should have won the Open, but for the extra club, perhaps. We'll never know.
Absolutely.
But if he, for example, would be the star attraction down in Monte Carlo, and Bernard Langer would be another of the star attractions, Langer would come to me early in the week, say, David, what is it you require of me? What are the social functions I've got to go to? Well, okay, Bernard, there's the gala dinner with his black tie on the Tuesday night in the sporting club, and Woozy would say, I have to go. So it's all to do with background and how they feel, because it can be an intimidating place. A packed press tent in those days was quite intimidating. There's a lot of strangers in the building. You didn't always know if someone had an axe to grind. You didn't know whether there had been previous between a writer and a player, and you were merely being the vehicle. So I wouldn't be too judgmental of them. As I said right at the beginning of this, I got on really well with most of the guys most of the time. There'd be odd time when Monty was trying to rebuild his swing. He didn't practice much, but there was one Open where he was trying to rebuild his swing. He was in disarray. The press were desperate to get him into the tent to get some quotes from him. And each hour would pass and he would say, I'm not coming, not coming, not coming. And then he said, not coming. And he just never did turn up in the end. Some of the Scots guys then stampeded out to try and get the order.
Yeah, Monty was, if I can interject for a minute or two, I mean, when I was doing newspaper work especially, I'd be at a European tour event and, you'd be wondering what the story was going to be. Monty would come in halfway through the afternoon and you'd have your story and more.
He used to think in headlines.
He was amazingly brilliant for the European tour in that respect. I mean, they got more publicity through not just his golf, but just the things he would say. You know,
Yeah, he was very articulate.
Yeah.
He had an understanding of his own game and his position in the game.
Yeah.
Particularly as the sort of standard bearer for the European Tour.
Yeah.
But we've talked about those who might not be the easiest to deal with. The most helpful, believe it or not, was Greg Norman.
Really? Yeah.
By a mile, the most helpful. He could not do enough for you. And I think it cost him the Open at Troon in 1989.
Right.
He finished so far ahead of the others. If you remember, he was way out earlier before Wayne Grady and the others finished. And he then came into the press tent and spent an hour back, almost like Bobby Clampett. I've seen this movie before. And I said, are you sure, Greg? Whereas Paul Lawrie, for example, when he won, he was kept away by Adam Hunter, quietly composed himself. You might still be involved here. You're coming from 10 behind, but you might be involved. There might be a playoff. You need to be ready for it. Because Greg was in a playoff, adrenaline's flowing, overhits his tee shot down the last, and the rest is history. Kalkovecki is the winner. Greg was wonderfully helpful. He would take us out for a meal, not during an open week. That was obviously too busy. Nobody was going for any meals anywhere. I mean, we were arriving for dinner at 10 o'clock at night, and the R&A wives would say, get these children out of here, because we were dressed in our scruff.
Right.
I hadn't had time to go home and shower and change and get all beautified, you know. Greg was really helpful. He took us out for a meal. We'd write thank you notes. I just can't speak highly of him.
Interesting.
And was really fluent. The only golfer more fluent was Laura Davis. I couldn't keep up.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think any stenographer could keep
She
up.
is terrific. You know,
And she's so softly
She just
spoken.
tells you what she thinks, and no matter what.
Yeah.
In my experience, anyway.
And softly spoken.
Yeah.
If Greg was asked a question, there was no humming and hawing and emming and ahhing. He knew exactly what he wanted to say, and it was out there. And Laura was the same, but Laura spoke very quietly. And sometimes you sat alongside and thought, you know, wow, you are some woman. And she was very self-deprecating.
Yeah.
She said, who would have me? And I said, who would have you? You're lovely.
Yeah.
I mean, I said, to her,
Yeah,
"You're
I think she was very self-conscious about her size.
She was.
No question.
She was.
To no reason. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's just sad, but yeah.
But a
that's the way it
sports
was.
nut.
Yes.
An
yeah.
absolute sports nut and a fantastic golfer.
Yeah.
I mean, Hall of Fame, I don't know. Is she in the Hall of Fame now in the States?
I think so. Yeah.
Because there was a time
she should be.
she was one tournament short, and I could never understand that.
Let's go off a tangent here,
Right.
just for a minute. You mentioned, because of what you've said about Greg Norman, what do you make of where he is these days?
It pains me.
Yeah.
It pains me greatly because, as I said in a tweet, people have maybe occasionally followed me on Twitter, it pained me that he should be the fall guy and the bad guy. But he had this thing about the PGA Tour. He wanted a world circuit for the top players, and he never ever quite settled that grievance. I've never spoken to him about it. I don't know him. I haven't seen him since I retired. But because of our relationship in the working years at his prime as a player and his open wins, it pains me that he should be the fall guy. Money is just hideous.
Yeah, I mean,
It's just hideous.
yeah. It's so.
Couple more.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Nick Price.
Yeah.
The most possessive.
Yeah. Possessive.
Possessive. Often when you're working alongside the players in their moment of glory, they have the trophy with them. And often they will give me the trophy because they've got other things to do, signing, whatever, to make sure it's safe.
Yeah.
Nick Price wouldn't let go. He said, David, I've had it in my right hand at Troon, my left hand at Lytham. I've now got it to myself at Turnberry. You are not getting it. And he would tuck it under his arm. So he was the most possessive. And John Daly was the most patient.
Right.
He could not do enough for people. On the hour and a half after he won, there are so many sort of standard duties. And it used to be one of those that you would go to the committee room and mingle with the guys who have given of their time to run the championship. Because the Open is largely run by volunteers who work their way through the R&A committees and for that week are part of the championship committee, which is about 10 strong. And Daly did all of that, did long interviews with people. And there he was the next morning in the West Sands, ready for action again, and another 2 hours with photographers taking photographs and the public. Every member of the public who wanted something that morning got it. Now, obviously, his schedule had allowed him to stay in St Andrews and be there, but he was so patient. And in his moment of victory, I was standing beside him when Roca was facing that putt, and his then wife, I think she was wife, not partner, said, "Oh, you've won it, you've won it, you've won
Wife
it."
number, whatever it
Well,
was.
but he said, "You've won it, you've won it." He said, "No, you could hold this."
Yeah.
He actually said, "You can hold this," and he said, "Right, let's go to the playoff." So he was ready for the playoff.
Yeah.
He was, and then of course he said, "And what the hell do you want me to say?" He said at the prize giving, and that was the time I decided that if the managers and the agents weren't going to brief their players and give them the prompt sheet, I would do it.
Right.
So that became another role for the press officer right in my final 2 years. At Lytham, I handed over a sheet to the winner, and then at Troon, I handed Justin Leonard a sheet. Here are the people to mention.
Yeah.
Here are the people to thank you. Mention Bartley Howard as the winner of the amateur.
Yeah.
You got a great right. And he then said to the New York Times, "Actually, I got more credit for my speech after the prize giving, than I did for
famously great speech he made. Yeah.
So I was pleased about that.
Yeah.
That pleased me a lot, actually. But the agent should be doing that kind of thing.
Well, of course. Yeah.
But you see, you look at tennis players like Djokovic now, and he can be fluent in 4 languages.
Yeah. And Federer was the same.
It's in the same.
Yeah.
Golfers, alas, would not have that level of
it's
style.
Not, yeah. It's mostly an English language sport.
Yeah.
What would be your favourite Open, looking back?
Oh, 84. Without question. Seve's moment of victory was.
Yeah.
I felt sorry for Tom. Immortality there. Mm-hmm. That would be my favourite. My least favourite was as a commentator on BBC Radio in 2009. I was calling the 18th green and Tom Watson's miss. And it was just tragic.
What did you say? Can you remember?
I think I just said tragic.
And it's not really tragic.
In the sporting terms it was, though.
Yeah.
If ever I had one sporting moment in all my life to recall, and no harm to Stuart Sink, it would be that Tom Watson would get up and down at the last and win the Open.
Yeah, I mean,
Actually, he was unlucky because the irony...
The bounce on the second shot...
it was incredible because the night before, the late George Brown, the head greenkeeper, was apoplectic because they were testing a thing called the bubbleometer. And the bubbleometer checked the sort of amount of deviation as the ball ran over the putting surface. Right. And they were up and down in this with this machine. And there was about 20 guys on that 18th green the night before watching this machine go through its process. And it got that hard bounce in a way. You
think it was down to that?
Well, maybe it was the gods conspiring against him. You're not getting that sixth major.
Yeah. I do remember the press centre or the media centre was like a morgue when Watson came in. I mean, he even had to cheer everybody else up because it had ruined the great story that everybody was going to write.
And if ever there was a story for an 18-hole playoff, that was it.
Aye. Yeah.
Because he wasn't ready for it. He had no chance.
Well, as soon as you could tell by the putt he hit on 18 to win that that was it. He was running on empty after that.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, he did get ahead in the first playoff hole, but they had no chance.
No.
Adrenaline had stopped.
Yeah.
So I'd love that to it. But the 84 was good. It was almost too early for me. And the facilities were horrendous in those days. I mean, it was awful.
When Seve held that putt, I saw it live. I was sitting in the grandstand to the right of the first tee with my friend John Grant, who's now working for the Links Trust in St Andrews. He reminded me recently that we'd sneaked in and paid that day, but I'd forgotten that.
As you did.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you're right. I mean, what a moment that was. I mean, every single person in the grandstand stood up when he held it.
Yeah, it's kind of, in cricketing terms, it's Ben Stokes.
Aye.
But it was just a magic moment. And the cameras got it and he kept doing it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've got one on my wall and Seve's there and it just has the perfect angle. It's the ferocious tiger before the real joy then comes into his face. He's dark at that moment because he's won it. Yeah. It's the matador and the bull. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful moment.
And the great thing about the putt was it never looked like going in until it did.
No, he'd read it perfectly.
Yeah. He's your favourite? I mean, we're sitting here in your office, David, and he's up on the wall with the autograph. The biggest picture on the wall is him.
Yeah, but the biggest picture actually is Arnold.
Well, I don't know. It'd be close.
Well,
I'd give Seve the edge.
Seve's the edge in terms of the space he takes up in the photograph.
But you've got Arnold waving from the bridge as
because Arnold got me into golf in terms of perhaps pursuing a career in golf. I was one of Arnold's army at Troon, and I just thought this is something different. Mm-hmm. And he was such a great guy. And when I was given the privilege of his final Open in 1995, I'd gone to him the night before and said, Arnold, there'll be a wee toast to you. What would be your tipple so that I've got it ready for you? And I had a wee bottle of famous grouse underneath the interview table.
Right.
And he said, I'll never forget, he just said, well, I guess it's over. So I really did like him. The one I missed was Jack. I would love to have brought Jack Nicklaus in as a winner of an Open and to have seen what that would have been like for everybody, including him. I got hints of it when he played well at Lytham in the second round. He bounced back from that 75 with a 70. And everybody was eating out of his hands. They were putty in his hands. Mm-hmm. He was so big. Yeah. He was way, way the biggest superstar in the game. Yeah. Somebody called him this morning on the radio, Jack Nicholson. But Jack Nicklaus was the king.
Yeah. Do you would see these guys behind the scenes far more than even members of the press would. I mean, do you subscribe to the theory that almost without exception, I mean, these guys were hard bastards. I mean, they were nice human beings away from it, but they were hard as nails when it came to,
I think golf. They had to be.
Every single one of them who's been the best player in the world, with very few exceptions. I mean, you mentioned Nick Price and Sandy Lyle. They might be the two nicest people who've been number one in the world at any one time, but the rest of them, hard men.
Well, that's what Bill Watson, who I referred to way earlier on, said to me. David, all these guys are pure bastards.
Yeah.
Bastard was the word he used because he said it's an individual sport. They are out to win. The Ryder Cup is different because the camaraderie of a team is something exceptional but unusual. But in individual tournament play, they are there to win. Yeah. It used to be said of Trevino, who was a bit of a wisecracker, he never brought in the winner unless it was himself. Tony, go ahead and take it. The Open is yours. No, he didn't. Trevino won.
Well, Trevino was playing with Sanders in 1970 as well, when Sanders missed the putt.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Faldo, he destroyed Faldo, which was what made Faldo go back to
Was that his Birkdale?
Birkdale.
83, yeah.
This is when the tough get going, back nine.
Yeah.
And so he was difficult, because they were bastards. They wanted to win.
Trevino was as hard as nails. No question. Yeah. So his upbringing had a lot to do with that, I think.
The guy that started me in golf, in one sense, was Gene Sarazen. I've got a picture of Gene here signed to me, because I got to know him at St Andrews. He turned up for a Shell Wonderful World of Golf match, and he borrowed my putter. Right. I was on the wee putting green. If you know, it used to be a wee putting green over to the right of the first hole. And the PA came across and said, Mr. Sanders would like to borrow your putter. Oh, yes, a putter. And had this curvy bent putter, which actually, sadly, was destroyed in the fire in Glasgow Golf Clubhouse at Killerman a number of years ago. And as a result of that, I exchanged correspondence with Gene Sarazen. And I used to go over and do the Gene Sarazen World Open.
Right, Atlanta,
at Chateau Elan. His friend Donald Panos got Gene to get involved in that. So, I go way back, and I never saw him play other than at Troon in 78. Was it 78?
73.
73, with Weisskopf won. 73. And so, I never really got to see him play, but I did get on very well with him.
Yeah.
And we did a wonderful interview with Gene sitting there and Ian Paul of the Glasgow Herald on the other end of the phone and doing a 2-page spread on Gene Sarazen.
Yeah, I remember when I was at Golf Digest in America, I was asked to get in touch with Gene Sarazen for some story or other, and they had the number. And I phoned, I was thinking, well, this will be the agent. So I phoned up. It was him. He was sitting watching the telly in his living room, and it was, hello, how are you? It was great. Yeah.
It was great. It was lovely. Yeah. So I've had a very blessed career. As you know, I spent a lot of time covering football around the world. I got to 50 countries covering football as a commentator. But that was really a hobby. Running media centres was where I made my money in the early days until I stopped in 1997. I mean, it destroyed me. The Open destroyed me. It's deep in my soul. I love it to bits, but I couldn't handle the pressure of it eventually. I wanted everything to go really well for everybody. And a number of photographers kind of almost blackmailed me in 1996. They wanted a press pass, or I was never getting any work for my agency for their newspaper.
Really?
And I just said to Stuart McDougall, who's followed me on, I can't take this anymore. And in the June, it was an overnight decision. I came in and said, Stuart, I'm giving up the Open at the end of 1997 at Troon. Yeah, you can take it if you want. It's up to the R&A.
That's a terrible story, David.
It is. It was very sad.
Yeah.
But I was, I struggled hugely with depression.
Yeah.
And it was because I was a bit of a perfectionist.
Yeah.
And because I wanted things to go well for everybody, and they couldn't go well for everybody sometimes.
Yeah. Last question: do you think of yourself as a golfer, broadcaster, footballer? Where do you sit? What would be on your epitaph?
Sports nut.
Sports nut, right? Just general.
Because my favourite sport is cricket. We haven't mentioned cricket, but I mean, I watched every single ball of the first Test, and it wasn't a great finish for
remember this
England.
You've got an Australian audience here,
but Pat Cummins was great, and Lyon was magnificent, and they took it to England in the final hour, which was superb. And yesterday I watched every single ball of Scotland against Ireland. Now, people will be saying, Scotland playing cricket. They don't play cricket, do they? Well, they're actually in a World Cup qualifying tournament, and one off the last ball of the 50th over in the game, and it was superb.
Even I watched that, I must admit.
It was fantastic.
Yeah. So, anyway, David, I'm conscious that we're over the hour. It's been fascinating listening to you. I love your stories, especially about the Open, which I can remember being part of it. Me being scared to death of you earlier in my career, but you've turned out to be a lovely man.
Well, it's been a pleasure,
It's very
John.
disappointing. Where is this ogre that I was expecting?
Well,
I'm only kidding.
It's been a pleasure. And to my friends in Australia, I have so many happy memories of a trip down under in 1990. Tom Ramsey, the great Australian golf writer, became a really good friend, and he and Carmel came to the Open. And Richie Beno and his wife Daphne, they came to cover the Open for Mark McCormick.
Well, he was a great friend of Renton Laidlaw's.
He was. And Richie and his wife looked after us when we went down to Coogee. Right. We went to Doyle's on the beach and had John Dory. And we just loved Australia. And had I been younger, we would have emigrated.
Right.
There's no question about that.
You think it would have had you?
Well, I think I might have.
I think you'd have
had some sort of living. You know?
You're a £10 palm.
Yeah, £10 palm.
Yeah. Anyway, David, thank you for your time. It's
John,
been a pleasure.
thank you. Pleasure.
Some really fascinating stories there from David Begg, and a perspective we don't often get, particularly some of what he told us about some of the game's top players. A big thanks to both Huggy and David for taking the time to do that interview. Well, that's it for episode 97, but hopefully you'll be back for episode 98 when we talk to a golfer who created a very special piece of history back in May.
So I was like, all I need to do here is hit the fair. I have a one-shot lead. He pushed this right. It's dead there. So I ripped this driver. Best driver hit all day. Kip had to take it unplayable. So I was inside saying, happy days, right? This is great. So he hit his next shot into the bunker. I hit my 9-iron to about 15 feet, which was a great shot just over the pin. Then he got up and down from the bunker and made a 5. So I'm saying, oh, here, don't 3-putt this, please. Don't 3-putt it.
That's inaugural Golf for the Disabled Open winner Brendan Lawler. Next time on The Thing About Golf.